Welcome to the Story Vault where mysteries come to life. Don't forget to like this video and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Chapter 1, A Frightful Awakening. The village of St. Mary Me lay serene under a blanket of autumn mist, its cobbled streets and charming cottages untouched by the chaos of the wider world. On such a tranquil night, Reverend Henry Langley found himself abruptly awakened by an unsettling disturbance. The grandfather clock in his bedroom ticked with an unusual persistence, each chime echoing ominously through the silent house. Reverend Langley, a man of routine and gentle disposition, felt an inexplicable thirst that nudged him from his slumber. Sliding out of bed, he wrapped himself in a soft dressing gown and padded quietly down the hallway. The house was cloaked in shadows, the moonlight casting long, wavering silhouettes on the walls. As he made his way to the kitchen, the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke wafted through the air, a comforting reminder of the village's peaceful existence. Yet, as he reached for a glass from the cupboard, a sudden sharp pain seared through his side. Startled, Reverend Langley recoiled, only to find a glint of metal catching the moonlight, a knife. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to comprehend the attack. Before he could fully register what was happening, the figure lunged again, the blade pressing against his flesh with alarming precision. Reverend Langley, though taken aback, managed to grasp the assailant's wrist, feeling the cold grip of fear and determination. The confrontation was swift and silent, a dance of shadows and pain in the dead of night. Finally, the attacker withdrew, leaving Reverend Langley bruised, but miraculously alive. Breathing heavily, he leaned against the kitchen counter, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. Who would seek to harm a humble clergyman such as himself? The motive was unclear, yet the attempt was deliberate and calculated. Reverend Langley knew that such an act could not be dismissed as a mere burglary gone wrong or a random act of violence. There was a deeper, more sinister plot at play. The following morning, Reverend Langley sat in his study, the early sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden desk cluttered with sermons and parish records. He pondered the night's events, his mind racing through possibilities. The attack had seemed personal, too precise to be the work of a stranger. He considered the dynamics of his household, his wife Elena, their daughter Margaret, his brother Edward, Mr. Jenkins the servant, and Mrs. Hargreaves, the caretaker for his elderly mother. Each held a key to his life and, perhaps unknowingly, to a motive for malice. Reverend Langley had always prided himself on maintaining harmonious relationships, but secrets, as he now feared, might be lurking beneath the surface. Determined to uncover the truth, he knew he needed assistance beyond his own limited means. It was then that the idea of seeking out Miss Marple came to him. Renowned in St. Mary Mead for her unparalleled knack for solving mysteries that baffled even the most astute, Miss Marple was a trusted confidant for many in the village. Her reputation for sharp observation, psychological insight, and a touch of subtle humor made her the perfect candidate to unravel the tangled web surrounding his attempted murder. With a resolute heart, Reverend Langley penned a letter to Miss Marple detailing the unsettling events of that fateful night and requesting her assistance. He enclosed a modest sum to cover her expenses, hoping she would accept his plea for help. As he sealed the envelope, a sense of hope mingled with anxiety. Perhaps with Miss Marple's keen mind, the shadows that had descended upon his life could be dispelled. Days passed with little indication of Miss Marple's arrival, but Reverend Langley remained steadfast in his belief that she would come. His faith, both spiritual and personal, held him steady as he awaited the resolution of this unnerving chapter in his life. Little did he know, the gentle yet formidable Miss Marple was already on her way, ready to illuminate the darkness with her unparalleled insight. Chapter 2, Assembling the Suspects. Miss Marple arrived at the Langley residence on a crisp Monday morning, the sun casting a warm glow over the well-tended gardens of the venerable house. The grand façade, with its ivy-clad walls and ornate shutters, exuded an air of timeless elegance. As she approached the sturdy oak door, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and rang the bell, her presence as unassuming as ever. Eleanor Langley greeted her at the door, her demeanor poised and graceful. A woman in her early 50s, Eleanor possessed a serene beauty, her silver hair neatly pinned back and her eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she said with a gentle smile, stepping aside to allow her guest entry. Inside, the house was a harmonious blend of classic charm and modern comfort. The spacious drawing room, adorned with family portraits and antique furnishings, served as the perfect setting for Miss Marple's inquiries. Shortly after settling in, Eleanor introduced her to the other members of the household. First was Margaret Langley, the minister's daughter, a vibrant young woman in her mid-20s. Her lively spirit was evident in her animated gestures and bright eyes, though Miss Marple noticed a subtle shadow of sorrow that lingered beneath her cheerful exterior. Margaret greeted Miss Marple with a warm hug, her laughter filling the room, yet there was an unspoken melancholy that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Next was Edward Langley, Reverend Langley's younger brother. Tall and impeccably dressed, Edward exuded an air of authority and ambition. His firm handshake and reserved demeanor suggested a man accustomed to leadership, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension beneath his composed facade. Then came Mr. Jenkins, the Langley household's long-serving servant, a man in his late 40s. Mr. Jenkins was the epitome of discretion and reliability. His quiet presence and meticulous manner spoke of years spent maintaining the household's smooth operation. Miss Marple noted his keen attention to detail and the respectful distance he maintained, a trait that often masked deeper insights. Lastly, Mrs. Hargreaves was introduced. She served as the caretaker for Reverend Langley's elderly mother, a woman of advanced years. Mrs. Hargreaves moved with a quiet efficiency, her gentle manner a comforting presence in the household. Her interactions were courteous yet measured, revealing little about her personal thoughts or feelings. Miss Marple began her investigation with subtle observations and polite conversations, keenly aware that each individual carried their own secrets. Elena spoke softly about the household routines, her eyes occasionally darting away as if guarding hidden emotions. Margaret was lively, yet there was a hint of sorrow beneath her cheerful exterior. Edward maintained a reserved stance, his ambition barely concealed beneath his courteous facade. Mr. Jenkins, though a man of few words, exhibited a meticulous attention to detail that Miss Marple found intriguing. Lastly, Mrs. Hargreaves moved with quiet efficiency, her presence almost ghost-like as she attended to the needs of Reverend Langley's mother. As Miss Marple interacted with each suspect, she took note of their alibis and the subtle clues that might point to their involvement in the attempted attack. Elena mentioned feeling uneasy since the incident. Margaret seemed distracted yet cooperative. Edward provided a solid alibi for the night in question. Mr. Jenkins appeared loyal but secretive, and Mrs. Harries maintained a composed exterior, offering little beyond necessary pleasantries. It was clear that beneath the veneer of this respectable household lay a web of motives and opportunities, each person holding a piece of the puzzle that Miss Marple was determined to solve. With her sharp observation and innate understanding of human nature, Miss Marple set about untangling the intricate relationships and hidden resentments that could have led to Reverend Langley's attempted murder. As the day turned to evening, Miss Marple retired to her temporary guest room, her mind abuzz with the day's findings. She knew that the answers lay in the subtle nuances of behavior and the unspoken tensions that threaded through the Langley family. With a keen eye and a patient heart, Miss Marple was ready to delve deeper into the mystery, confident that the truth would soon reveal itself. Chapter 3: Elena's Entangled Secrets. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to delve deeper into Elena Langley's life, believing that the minister's wife held crucial pieces of the puzzle. With a gentle knock, she requested another audience with Elena, who welcomed her into the serene sunroom adorned with blooming geraniums and soft pastel drapes. "Elena, I appreciate your openness thus far. May I ask you a few more questions about your relationship with Reverend Langley?" Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as the afternoon light filtering through the windows. Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Of course, Miss Marple. What would you like to know?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting temporarily set aside. "You mentioned earlier that your sister and Reverend Langley were once quite close. Could you tell me more about that?" Eleanor sighed, her eyes clouding with a mix of nostalgia and sorrow. "Yes, my sister Victoria and Henry shared a strong bond in their younger years. They spent countless hours together discussing everything from theology to literature. Some villagers speculated about an affair, but Henry always dismissed such rumors as baseless." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with curiosity. Did Victoria ever speak about Henry in a way that suggested more than familial affection? Elena hesitated, then continued softly. "Victoria was always the more vivacious of us. She had a charm that drew people in, including Henry. While there was certainly a deep affection, I believe it was platonic. However, such intense friendships often fuel misunderstandings. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And how did you feel about their relationship? Elena's gaze met Miss Marple's, revealing a flicker of vulnerability. Initially, I was supportive. Henry and I have always been partners in both marriage and ministry. But as time passed, I sensed an emotional distance growing between us. Perhaps it was the strain of his duties or my own preoccupations. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. It's natural for relationships to evolve. But did this distance ever lead to significant disagreements or conflicts? Elena paused. Reflecting, there were disagreements, yes. Henry became more absorbed in his work, often late into the night. I sometimes felt neglected, but I loved him dearly. I never wished him harm. Miss Marple observed Elena's composed demeanor, noting the subtle tremor in her hands as she reached for her teacup. Have you noticed any changes in Henry's behavior recently? Anything unusual that might shed light on the attack? Elena frowned slightly. Now that you mention it, Henry had been more secretive lately. He took to working late in his study, rarely sharing details of his activities. I assumed it was related to parish matters. But perhaps there's more to it. Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. Secrecy can often be a veil for hidden troubles. Did Henry ever confide in you about any specific concerns or threats? Elena shook her head. He was always a man of discretion. If there were issues, he handled them quietly. I can't think of anyone who would wish him harm, except perhaps those who opposed his work or personal life. Miss Marple's mind raced through the possibilities, piecing together Elena's insights with her own observations. Thank you, Elena. Your candor is most helpful. One last question, have you noticed anyone behaving oddly around the house or showing undue interest in Henry's affairs? Elena considered for a moment. Actually, Mrs. Hargreaves has been acting somewhat distant lately. She used to be more forthcoming, but recently she seems preoccupied, almost secretive. However, I couldn't quite place why. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with renewed interest. Thank you, Elena. You've provided invaluable information. I believe this will greatly aid in uncovering the truth behind Reverend Langley's attack. As Elena rose to leave, Miss Marple couldn't help but admire her resilience. The minister's wife, once a pillar of grace, now revealed layers of complexity that hinted at underlying tensions. With Elena's revelations about Victoria's relationship and Henry's increasing secrecy, the web of motives thickened, guiding Miss Marple closer to the heart of the mystery. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her guest room, poring over her notes. Elena's insight suggested that personal grievances and hidden emotions played a significant role in the attempted attack. The mention of Mrs. Harry's unusual behavior added another thread to the intricate tapestry of suspects. As the shadows lengthened outside her window, Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to align, each clue bringing her closer to unraveling the truth behind Reverend Langley's midnight visitor. Chapter 4, Margaret's Bitter Heart. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains as Miss Marple prepared for her next interview. Having gleaned significant insights from Elena Langley, she now turned her attention to Margaret, the minister's daughter. Margaret's vivacious nature and the subtle sorrow beneath her cheerful exterior had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity, suggesting that there might be more to her than met the eye. Miss Marple found Margaret in the drawing room, seated by the window with a book in hand. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her bright eyes sparkled with a mix of warmth and underlying tension. As Miss Marple entered, Margaret looked up and offered a radiant smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "It's lovely to see you again," Margaret greeted, her voice melodious and inviting. "Good morning, Margaret. May I join you?" Miss Marple asked, settling into a comfortable chair opposite her. "Of course," Margaret replied, setting her book aside. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all. I wanted to speak with you about the night Reverend Langley was attacked," Miss Marple began gently. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features. "Yes, that was a frightful night. I was at a party with friends celebrating the harvest festival. Several villagers can vouch for my presence there." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note to verify the alibi. "Tell me, Margaret, how have you been feeling since the attack?" Margaret sighed, her eyes momentarily distant. "It has been difficult. Father has always been a pillar of strength, but this incident has shaken him deeply, and of course, it has affected all of us. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone encouraging. I understand that such an event can stir up many emotions. I wanted to ask you about something from your past that might be relevant to our investigation. Margaret's curiosity was piqued. Anything, Miss Marple. I want to help in any way I can. Taking a deep breath, Miss Marple continued, I understand that your father was involved in the unfortunate death of your former lover, James Whittaker. Could you tell me more about that? Margaret's face paled slightly, and she looked away, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. James and I were inseparable in our youth. We dreamed of a future together, but circumstances tore us apart. Father, he believed James was leading me astray, and in his frustration, he confronted him. It was a heated argument, and things escalated beyond anyone's control. Miss Marple observed Margaret carefully, noting the genuine pain in her eyes. That must have been a traumatic experience for you. How has it affected your relationship with your father since then? Margaret took a moment before responding. It created a distance between us. I love my father dearly, but I've always felt that he didn't understand me. The loss of James left a void that I've struggled to fill. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Such deep-seated emotions can often influence our actions in ways we might not immediately recognize. Have you ever felt resentment towards your father? Because of what happened with James, Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. There were times when I felt angry and abandoned, but I've tried to move past it, to focus on healing and building my own life. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. I commend your strength, Margaret. It's important to acknowledge and address our feelings. One last question, can you think of anyone who might hold a grudge against your father or have a reason to wish him harm? Margaret shook her head. Not that I can think of. Our family is well regarded in the community, and father has always been dedicated to his parish work. If anyone had a reason to target him, I'm not aware of it. As the conversation drew to a close, Miss Marple thanked Margaret for her openness. She left the drawing room with a heavy heart, contemplating the layers of grief and resentment that lay beneath Margaret's bright exterior. The connection between the past and the present was undeniable, suggesting that the shadows of old wounds could still cast long and dark lines over the present. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her guest room, reflecting on her findings. Margaret's history with James Whittaker added a compelling dimension to the case, presenting a possible motive rooted in personal loss and unresolved emotions. Yet Margaret's alibi seemed solid, supported by multiple witnesses. The detective knew that understanding the intricate web of relationships and past grievances was essential to uncovering the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted murder. With a thoughtful expression, Miss Marple resolved to delve deeper into Margaret's past, seeking connections that might illuminate hidden motives. The mystery was becoming increasingly complex, but Miss Marple's unwavering determination assured her that the answers were within reach. Chapter 5, Edward's ambitious veins. The following day dawned bright and clear, casting a hopeful light over St. Mary. Miss Marple, undeterred by the previous day's revelations, set her sights on Edward Langley, Reverend Langley's younger brother. Edward's composed demeanor and apparent ambition made him a person of interest in the unfolding mystery. Miss Marple found Edward in his study, a room lined with shelves of books and papers meticulously arranged. He looked up from his desk, adjusting his glasses with a practiced grace. Tall and impeccably dressed, Edward exuded an air of authority that Miss Marple found both intriguing and slightly intimidating. Good morning, Edward, Miss Marple greeted warmly, taking a seat opposite him. Good morning, Miss Marple. To what do I owe the pleasure? Edward replied, his tone courteous but reserved. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the night Reverend Langley was attacked, Miss Marple began, her eyes kind yet probing. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Of course. I'm still quite shaken by the incident. Reverend Henry is like a brother to me. Miss Marple nodded, observing the subtle tightness around his jaw. I understand you were away on a business trip that night. Could you tell me more about that? Edward sighed, rubbing his temples briefly before continuing. Yes, I was in London attending a conference on church administration. Several colleagues can confirm my presence there. It was an important meeting that I couldn't afford to miss. Miss Marple made a mental note to verify his alibi with the conference organizers. I see. Your absence certainly provides a strong alibi. However, I'm curious about your relationship with Reverend Langley. It's evident you both share a deep bond, but I've also heard whispers of ambition on your part. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his features. Ambition. I admire my brother greatly and have always supported his work. If anything, I've considered taking on more responsibilities to help the parish thrive. Miss Marple smiled gently. Ambition can be a double-edged sword, Edward. It's important to balance personal goals with familial harmony. Have there ever been disagreements between you and Reverend Langley regarding the direction of the parish or other matters? Edward hesitated for a moment before responding. There have been professional discussions, yes. It's natural for siblings to have different viewpoints, but nothing that would lead to ill feelings or conflict. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze steady. I understand. It's important to maintain good relationships, especially within the family. However, considering your ambition, did you ever feel that Reverend Langley was holding you back or overshadowing your contributions? Edward paused, his expression guarded. I've always respected his position and his experience. If I ever felt overshadowed, I chose to address it through constructive dialogue rather than resentment. Miss Marple nodded, accepting his explanation but noting the slight tension in his posture. Thank you, Edward. Your cooperation is much appreciated. One last question, do you have any insights into who might have wished harm upon Reverend Langley? Edward shook his head. I can't think of anyone with such intentions. Reverend Henry is beloved by the community, and I'm certain no one would want to harm him. As their conversation concluded, Miss Marple felt a mix of relief and lingering suspicion. Edward's alibi seemed solid, supported by multiple sources, yet his guarded responses hinted at deeper layers beneath his courteous exterior. His ambition, while not overly malicious, added a complex dimension to the investigation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the local church where Edward had been presenting, speaking with a few of his colleagues. She confirmed his attendance at the conference, solidifying his alibi. Yet the whispers of his ambition echoed in her mind, suggesting that while Edward might not have had the opportunity to attack his brother, his desires could have influenced others around him. Returning to the Langley household, Miss Marple reflected on her findings. Edward's ambition, combined with his strong presence, painted a picture of a man striving for recognition and authority. While not directly implicated, his role within the family and the parish could intersect with the motives of others. As evening descended, Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her thoughts weaving through the intricate relationships within the Langley household. Edward's ambition was a piece of the puzzle, but the true culprit remained elusive. With each interview, the mystery deepened, and Miss Marple's determination to uncover the truth only grew stronger. Chapter 6, Mr. Jenkins's Hidden Key. The following morning, Miss Marple resolved to delve deeper into the life of Mr. Jenkins, the Langley household's long-serving servant. His quiet demeanor and meticulous nature had always suggested reliability, but recent revelations necessitated a closer examination. Equipped with her notebook and an air of gentle determination, she made her way to the servant's modest quarters. Mr. Jenkins greeted her with a respectful nod as she entered his neatly kept room. A man in his late 40s, Mr. Jenkins carried an aura of steadfastness. His attire was simple yet impeccably clean, reflecting his dedication to his role. Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you today? He asked, his voice steady and composed. Good morning, Mr. Jenkins, Miss Marple replied warmly. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me again. Of course, Miss Marple. Reverend Langley has always spoken highly of you, he responded, settling into a chair opposite her. Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes kind yet inquisitive. I wanted to discuss your role in the household, particularly regarding Reverend Langley's personal affairs. Mr. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. I handle many of the minister's personal matters, including the upkeep of his study and the security of his personal belongings. Yes, I understand you possess a key to Reverend Langley's vault. Could you tell me more about that? Miss Marple inquired, observing his calm demeanor. Mr. Jenkins hesitated for a moment before replying, Yes, Miss Marple. The vault contains important documents and valuables. Reverend Langley trusts me to maintain its security. The key is always on my person during my duties. Miss Marple made a mental note of his explanation. And were you in possession of the key on the night of the attack? Mr. Jenkins nodded. Indeed, I was attending to some maintenance in the study, ensuring everything was in order. Reverend Langley often works late, and I make sure his environment is conducive to his duties." Miss Marple watched him closely, searching for any sign of deceit. "Did you notice anything unusual that evening, any disturbances or unfamiliar visitors?" Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. The household was quiet, as it usually is late at night. I was in the study, and after my rounds, I retired to my quarters." "Your alibi is important, Mr. Jenkins. Did anyone see you during your rounds or have any interaction with you that night?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Mr. Jenkins considered the question. "Not specifically. Most of the household was asleep, and Reverend Langley was in his study. I was alone, as usual." Miss Marple nodded, accepting his response but noting the slight tension in his posture. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Your cooperation is much appreciated." As she rose to leave, Miss Marple felt a mix of relief and lingering suspicion. While Mr. Jenkins had a plausible alibi, the possession of the vault key remained a critical piece of the puzzle. Access to the vault could imply knowledge of valuable items or sensitive documents that might provide a motive for the attack. Determined to verify his statements, Miss Marple decided to inspect the vault herself. Later that afternoon, she accompanied Mr. Jenkins to Reverend Langley's study. The room was a blend of scholarly order and personal comfort, with shelves of books and carefully arranged papers. The vault, a sturdy metal door embedded in the wall, stood as a silent sentinel. Mr. Jenkins produced the key and unlocked the vault with practiced ease. Inside, Miss Marple observed neatly organized documents, a few personal mementos, and several locked boxes. "Is there anything of particular importance here that might shed light on recent events?" she inquired. Mr. Jenkins glanced around before responding. "The documents are mostly parish records and personal correspondence. The locked boxes contain valuables and some personal items Reverend Langley chose to keep private." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the contents. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. This information is very helpful." As she left the study, Miss Marple pondered the significance of the key. While Mr. Jenkins had access to the vault, there was no concrete evidence linking him directly to the attack. However, the ability to enter the vault undetected still posed a potential risk, keeping him firmly within the realm of suspicion. That evening, Miss Marple retreated to her guest room, her thoughts turning over the day's findings. Mr. Jenkins's role in the household was undeniably significant, and his access to the vault added a new layer to the mystery. Yet, without further evidence, his innocence or guilt remained. Uncertain with the investigation progressing steadily, Miss Marple felt confident that each revelation brought her closer to uncovering the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted murder. As the night deepened, she prepared for the next phase of her inquiry, knowing that patience and keen observation would ultimately reveal the hidden motives within the Langley household. Chapter 7: The Caretaker's Cloak. The morning sun cast a golden hue over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple prepared to investigate the enigmatic Mrs. Hargreaves, the caretaker for Reverend Langley's elderly mother. Mrs. Hargreaves had always seemed a figure of quiet dedication, yet recent revelations hinted at layers beneath her unassuming exterior that warranted closer scrutiny. Miss Marple began her day with a visit to the local library. Poring over any available records about Mrs. Hargreaves, she discovered that Mrs. Hargreaves had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 2 years prior, her background largely a mystery. Intrigued by the lack of information, Miss Marple felt compelled to delve deeper. Returning to the Langley residence, Miss Marple found Mrs. Hargreaves tending to the garden, her movements precise and efficient. The caretaker was a slender woman in her 60s, her silver hair neatly coiffed and her attire modest yet impeccably clean. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you today?" she replied with a courteous smile, though her eyes held a guarded expression. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, observing the caretaker's demeanor. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I have a few more questions regarding the events surrounding Reverend Langley's attack." Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head slightly. "Of course, Miss Marple, please ask away." Miss Marple began gently. "I've noticed some inconsistencies in your accounts of recent activities. Could you tell me more about your role here and any unusual occurrences?" "You've observed Mrs. Hargreaves sigh softly, her gaze momentarily distant. My primary duty is to care for Reverend Langley's mother, ensuring her comfort and well-being. As for unusual occurrences, there hasn't been much to report. The household remains as peaceful as ever." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, sensing there was more to uncover. I understand. However, I've come across some information that suggests you might have connections beyond our village. Is there anything you can share about your past? A flicker of unease crossed Mrs. Hargreaves's face, but she quickly composed herself. My past is my own business, Miss Marple. I prefer to focus on my duties here. Miss Marple smiled gently. Of course, I respect your privacy. Yet, given the circumstances of Reverend Langley's attack, any information could be invaluable. Before Mrs. Hargreaves could respond, a knock echoed from the front door. It was Mr. Jenkins, the servant, bringing fresh tea for Miss Marple. As he entered, Miss Marple observed his brief interaction with Mrs. Hargreaves. There was a subtle tension, a silent exchange that did not go unnoticed. After Mr. Jenkins left, Miss Marple decided to inspect the caretaker's quarters. She found a small locked drawer in Mrs. Hargreaves's writing desk. With her polite inquiry, Mrs. Hargreaves reluctantly allowed her access. Inside, Miss Marple discovered a collection of foreign letters neatly tied with a ribbon and a few peculiar trinkets that did not belong to the household. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple confronted Mrs. Hargreaves with her findings. These letters and items suggest connections beyond what you've shared. Are you involved with any organizations or groups that might have an interest in Reverend Langley? Mrs. Hargreaves's composure faltered for a moment before she responded. I assure you, Miss Marple, my only concern is the welfare of Reverend Langley's mother and the smooth running of this household. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with insight. Sometimes our roles require us to wear different cloaks, Mrs. Hars. Your presence here, your dedication, it speaks of loyalty, yet these letters suggest otherwise. Are you perhaps a spy sent by a rival faction? The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mrs. Hargreaves's facade finally crumbled, revealing a weary resignation. Yes, Miss Marple, I was sent to monitor Reverend Langley. There are those who believe his influence could sway matters beyond our knowledge. Miss Marple listened intently, absorbing the gravity of the revelation. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Hargreaves. While your intentions may not have been malicious, your presence here complicates the situation. As Miss Marple left the Langley residence, she pondered the caretaker's confession. A spy in their midst added a new dimension to the mystery, intertwining personal motives with broader intrigues. Yet the true attacker still eluded her, and the shadow of suspicion loomed over each household member. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, the twilight deepening around her. Mrs. Hargreaves's role as a spy was a significant clue, but Miss Marple knew that the heart of the mystery lay in understanding the intricate web of relationships and hidden agendas within the Langley household. With renewed determination, she prepared for the final phase of her investigation, confident that the truth was within reach. Chapter 8: The Revelation. The grand oak door of Reverend Henry Langley's office stood ajar. As Miss Marple entered, her presence immediately commanded the attention of those gathered within. Eleanor, Margaret, Edward, Mr. Jenkins, and Mrs. Hargreaves were seated in a semicircle, their expressions a mix of anticipation and unease. Reverend Langley himself stood at the head of the room, his demeanor calm yet expectant. Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes methodically scanning each face before settling on the minister. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady and clear. After 3 weeks of careful investigation, I believe it's time to reveal the truth behind Reverend Langley's attempted attack. A collective murmur filled the room, tension thick in the air. Reverend Langley leaned forward, curiosity evident in his eyes. Miss Marple, how can you be so certain? Miss Marple smiled gently, appreciating the minister's genuine interest. Each of you had reasons that could have led to Reverend Langley's attack. However, upon closer examination, all alibis hold firm, leaving no room for doubt. Among the 5 of you, she began outlining her deductions. 1. Eleanor Langley. Eleanor was aware of her husband's past affair with her sister Victoria. This knowledge could breed resentment. However, Eleanor's history of taking sleeping pills made it unlikely she was awake and capable of the attack that occurred during the night. 2. Margaret Langley. Margaret harbored deep-seated grief over her father's role in her former lover James Whittaker's death. While this provided a motive, her alibi of attending a harvest party was corroborated by several villagers, making her presence elsewhere indisputable. 3. Edward Langley. Edward's ambition to ascend to his brother's position gave him a plausible motive. Nevertheless, his alibi of being away on a business trip was confirmed by conference attendees, eliminating him from suspicion. Fourth, Mr. Jenkins. Possessing the key to Reverend Langley's vault suggested potential access to valuables or sensitive documents. Yet Mr. Jenkins was accounted for, having been with Mrs. Hargraves in their quarters throughout the night. And Mrs. Hargraves, while her role as a spy introduced an element of intrigue. Her alibi, supported by Mr. Jenkins's testimony, firmly placed her away from the scene of the attack. Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her analysis to settle. The room fell silent, each individual grappling with their own reflections of the revelations. Reverend Langley's gaze met Miss Marple's, a flicker of realization dawning upon him. Then Miss Marple, who could it possibly be? With a serene smile, Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. The answer, Reverend, lies right before us. You orchestrated the attack yourself. Gasps and shocked murmurs erupted from the room as all eyes turned to the minister. Reverend Langley remained composed, a mixture of relief and amusement playing across his features. Indeed, Miss Marple. We attended the same school when we were children. I admired your detective aspirations even then. I wanted to test your skills and see if you could unravel a mystery as intricate as any you might face. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A clever ruse, Reverend. The absence of a genuine struggle and the discovery of the knife in your garret, where you often paint, were the key indicators of the staged attack. Reverend Langley chuckled softly. You're truly outstanding in your craft, Miss Marple. It seems your reputation is well deserved. Miss Marple offered a polite smile, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Thank you, Reverend. It was an intriguing case, and I'm pleased to have been of assistance. As the tension in the room dissolved into relieved laughter, Miss Marple gracefully took her leave. Reverend Langley walked her to the door, extending his hand warmly. Your skills are unparalleled, Miss Marple. I look forward to any future collaborations. With a final nod, Miss Marple stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The mystery elegantly resolved, as she made her way home, she couldn't help but chuckle softly to herself. Even the most elaborate puzzles could be unraveled with patience, keen observation, and a touch of subtle humor.